Tonight, we begin with a quiet story set far from any single country, law, or familiar street. It takes place at sea, inside the carefully ordered routines of a large passenger cruise ship, where thousands of people move through shared spaces designed for rest, celebration, and escape from ordinary life. In that floating environment, privacy and proximity exist side by side, and responsibility is spread across many systems that rarely attract attention when everything goes as planned. This is the case of Amy Lynn Bradley. Amy was a young American woman traveling with her family on a Caribbean cruise in the late 1990s. What began as an ordinary holiday would later become an international missing person investigation, shaped not only by uncertainty, but by the unusual legal and operational realities of life at sea. Tonight's story is told slowly and carefully, and it follows only what can be confirmed through official records, verified reporting, and documented investigative steps. It is not a dramatic reconstruction. It is a quiet account of how a disappearance inside a controlled environment becomes difficult to define, difficult to verify, and, over time, difficult to resolve. A cruise ship is designed to feel enclosed and secure. Access points are monitored. Passenger movement is structured around schedules, cabins, public venues, and organized activities. At the same time, the ship itself is not a closed building in the usual sense. It moves between ports, across jurisdictions, and through international waters, where responsibility and authority do not always operate in simple ways. For investigators, this creates a unique setting. Events do not take place within the boundaries of one city, one police department, or one legal system. Instead, responsibility must be shared between a private company, maritime authorities, and national law enforcement agencies, each working within their own limits. For families, it creates a different kind of uncertainty. When someone goes missing on land, there is usually a clear point of reference, a neighborhood, a last known address, a defined area in which searches can begin. At sea, the environment itself moves on. Locations change, passengers disembark, crew rotate. The physical space that once held everyone together continues its journey. The story of Amy Bradley sits within that shifting landscape. In public memory, her name has become associated with unanswered questions and long-running uncertainty. But behind the headlines and speculation, there is a quieter and more precise story. It is a story made up of small, rarefied moments, carefully recorded timelines, procedural decisions, and the limits faced by those tasked with finding answers in an environment not designed for criminal investigation. This case is not defined by spectacle. It is defined by process. It is defined by the way information was gathered, reviewed, and reassessed over time. It is defined by the difficulty of verifying witness memory in crowded shared spaces. It is defined by how responsibility is transferred between institutions when events unfold beyond national borders. Most importantly, it is defined by restraint. Because in cases like this, what cannot be confirmed matters just as much as what can. Over the years, many claims, theories, and reported sightings have circulated in connection with Amy's disappearance. Some were investigated, some were assessed and set aside. Others remain unresolved because they could not be supported by independent evidence. Tonight, those distinctions remain central to how this story is told. This is not a retelling of rumors. It is an account of how a disappearance aboard a commercial vessel becomes a long-term investigative challenge, shaped by jurisdiction, logistics, and the slow passage of time. As you listen, you may notice how often the language of this case returns to careful phrasing, to verified movement rather than assumed movement, to reported observation rather than confirmed presence, to probability rather than certainty. That is not hesitation. It is professional discipline. It reflects the way real investigations are maintained when answers are incomplete, and when conclusions must remain open to revision. The sea offers both openness and isolation. It connects countries, but it also separates people from the immediate reach of familiar institutions. In that space between movement and containment, between leisure and responsibility, this case quietly unfolded. Tonight, you are invited to listen gently and without expectation of resolution. This is not a story that moves quickly. It moves slowly through documented decisions, delayed recognition, evolving coordination, and the long work of review that continues long after public attention shifts elsewhere. As the night settles around you, allow this story to unfold at its own pace. We begin with a family holiday, a shared journey, and a disappearance that would later cross borders, agencies, and decades, while remaining rooted in a single unanswered question, quietly held within professional memory and careful record. The disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley took place during a family holiday aboard the cruise ship Rhapsody of the Seas, operated by Royal Caribbean International. At the time of the voyage, the ship functioned as a self-contained floating community. Thousands of passengers and crew members lived and worked within a structured environment designed to operate continuously, day and night. Movement around the vessel followed a predictable rhythm shaped by scheduled meals, entertainment events, organized excursions, and fixed service routines carried out by staff. The physical layout of the ship reflected this organization. Passenger cabins were arranged across multiple decks, connected by stairwells and elevators that linked accommodation areas to restaurants, lounges, theaters, and outdoor spaces. Crew areas were largely separated from public zones, although staff moved frequently through service corridors and internal passageways in order to maintain daily operations. Public areas were designed to remain accessible for extended hours. Bars, lounges, and open deck spaces were intended to encourage social activity late into the night. At the same time, cabins and private corridors created quieter spaces where passengers could withdraw from the shared environment. Security aboard the vessel focused primarily on safety and access control, rather than on crime prevention in the conventional sense. The ship operated its own internal procedures, overseen by officers and security personnel employed by the cruise line. Their responsibilities included monitoring passenger welfare, responding to medical incidents, managing disturbances, and coordinating with port authorities when necessary. Closed-circuit cameras were present in selected public areas, but coverage was not continuous across all spaces. Many corridors, decks, and cabin areas were not under constant video observation. This structure reflected industry practice at the time and the expectation that serious criminal incidents would be rare. The ship departed from the United States as part of a scheduled Caribbean itinerary. The voyage included several planned port calls in the region, where passengers would disembark during the day for organized excursions or independent sightseeing before returning to the ship in the evening. These port visits formed an important part of how passenger movement was managed. Each arrival and departure required large numbers of people to pass through controlled access points. Crew members verified boarding passes and cabin records, and port authorities supervised security procedures at the terminals. Once the ship left port, however, its operating environment changed. During time at sea, the vessel became a closed system. Passengers remained within the ship's physical boundaries, and external contact was limited to scheduled communications with maritime authorities and company operations centers. Responsibility for internal incidents rested primarily with the ship's officers. The itinerary for the Bradley family's cruise followed a typical pattern for Caribbean voyages of that period. Days were divided between port stops and open sea travel. Evenings were structured around dining schedules and entertainment programs, including live performances and social events in public lounges. This regular rhythm created predictable patterns of activity. Large numbers of passengers would move through the same spaces at similar times. Late at night, however, the atmosphere became quieter and less structured. Some venues remained open, while others closed and gradually emptied. The open deck areas were among the most fluid spaces on the ship. Passengers could move freely between indoor lounges and outdoor walkways. Railings separated walking paths from the open sea, and lighting varied depending on the section of the vessel. These outdoor areas were designed for relaxation rather than supervision. Crew members passed through regularly, but they were not continuously stationed along the decks during overnight hours. From an investigative perspective, the ship's design and routine mattered greatly. Unlike a hotel or a building on land, the cruise vessel was both a living space and a transport system. It was constantly in motion, and its population changed at each port. When an incident occurred, the physical environment that contained potential witnesses and evidence could not be sealed in place for extended periods, without disrupting the operation of the entire voyage. This operational reality shaped every decision that followed. Passenger movement records were primarily designed to support travel logistics rather than investigative reconstruction. Cabin assignments, dining bookings, and excursion rosters existed, but they did not provide a complete picture of where individuals moved throughout the night. Public areas encouraged social interaction between people who often did not know one another. A person could spend hours in lounges or on deck without encountering the same individuals twice. Conversations were brief, faces were unfamiliar, names were rarely exchanged. The Bradley family, like most passengers, were participating in a setting created to feel relaxed and informal. The environment encouraged a sense of safety and temporary community, even though most of the people on board were strangers to one another. For investigators later reviewing the case, this mixture of structure and anonymity became one of the defining features of the setting. The ship offered controlled access at its borders, but fluid movement within. It provided documented travel routes between ports, but only limited visibility into how individuals navigated the vessel itself. It maintained order through operational routines, but those routines were not designed to support detailed behavioral tracing. The Caribbean itinerary, the continuous movement of the ship, and the shared nature of its public spaces created a setting in which a single absence could go unnoticed for hours. And when that absence was finally recognized, the environment that had quietly contained it was already moving on, carrying passengers, crew, and unanswered questions across open water toward the next port of call. The woman at the center of this case is Amy Lynn Bradley. At the time of the cruise, Amy was traveling with her immediate family on what was intended to be a routine holiday in the Caribbean. The trip had been planned as a shared break from everyday life, combining time together on board the ship with scheduled visits to several ports during the voyage. According to confirmed family statements and later investigative summaries, the decision to take the cruise was not connected to any unusual circumstances. It was chosen in the same way many families choose such trips, as a structured and convenient form of travel where accommodation, transport, and daily activities are combined in one place. Amy traveled with her parents and her brother. The family shared adjoining or nearby cabins, and they spent much of their time together during the early part of the voyage. Meals, organized activities, and evening entertainment were often attended as a group. Those who later provided official statements described the atmosphere of the trip as relaxed and uneventful during the first days at sea. There were no reported disagreements, no known concerns about safety, and no indication that Amy intended to separate from her family or alter her travel plans. Amy was described by relatives and friends as independent and socially confident. She was comfortable interacting with new people and enjoyed the informal social setting that cruise travel often creates. At the same time, investigators found no evidence that she had made plans to meet anyone privately or to leave the ship during the voyage. From a factual standpoint, this absence of preparatory behavior is important. No confirmed messages, notes, or arrangements were discovered that suggested she expected to change her travel routine. The family's activities followed the normal pattern of life on board. Days were shaped by port visits and time spent exploring the ship. Evenings were structured around dining schedules and entertainment venues, such as lounges and performance areas that remained open late into the night. Family members later explained that Amy appeared to be enjoying the trip. There were no reported signs of distress, anxiety, or personal conflict during the days leading up to the night she was last seen. Investigators also examined whether Amy had expressed any dissatisfaction with the cruise itself. No such concerns were identified in verified interviews or contemporaneous accounts. The Bradley family's shared routine on board reflected the temporary and enclosed nature of cruise travel. With limited personal space and a fixed environment, family members often encountered one another naturally throughout the day. Even when individuals spent short periods apart, they typically regrouped for meals or scheduled activities. From an investigative perspective, this consistent family contact became a useful reference point. It established that Amy was not isolated from those closest to her, and that her presence on board was visible and regular. The family also took part in standard safety briefings and ship orientation activities at the beginning of the voyage. These briefings explained basic emergency procedures and introduced the general layout of the vessel. They did not include specific guidance about crime prevention or personal security, which reflected standard practice at the time. As part of the routine operation of the ship, no special monitoring or supervision of individual passengers was conducted. Movement throughout public spaces was free and informal. Passengers were not required to register their location or activities once they had boarded. For the family, this environment was experienced as convenient and comfortable. For investigators, it later became an important limitation, because no continuous record of passenger movement existed. There was no objective way to reconstruct Amy's precise movements across different decks and venues during the days of the voyage. Another important element in understanding the family context is how communication was handled on board. During the late 1990s, personal mobile phone use at sea was extremely limited. Passengers relied primarily on in-person contact or cabin telephones for internal communication. This meant that family members typically expected to find one another physically, rather than through electronic messages. If someone was not immediately present, the assumption was usually that they were elsewhere on the ship, attending an activity or resting in their cabin. This expectation of easy physical reconnection shaped how absence was perceived. Within the family, there was no early reason to interpret a short period of separation as unusual or concerning. Investigators later confirmed that Amy did not make any documented calls to individuals outside the ship during the voyage, and no verified electronic correspondence was identified that would indicate private arrangements or external contact. The family trip therefore presents a picture of routine and continuity rather than disruption. There were no known personal crises, no confirmed disagreements, and no documented changes in behavior that could point to an internal reason for Amy to leave her family or place herself at risk. This does not resolve what later happened, but it establishes a clear and important foundation. Amy's presence on the ship was ordinary. Her participation in the family holiday followed predictable patterns, and in the days leading up to her disappearance, there is no verified evidence that her intentions, plans, or relationships had changed in any meaningful way. For those later tasked with reviewing the case, this ordinary beginning remains one of the most difficult elements to reconcile with what followed. Because when a disappearance occurs within a setting built around shared experience and constant proximity, the absence of warning signs does not simplify the investigation. It makes the question of what happened next even harder to define. The final confirmed evening involving Amy Lynn Bradley unfolded within the normal social rhythm of life on board the ship. according to verified family statements and investigative summaries. The Bradley family spent the early part of the evening together, taking part in routine onboard activities and moving between public areas that were open to passengers at that time. Nothing unusual was reported during these earlier hours. There were no disagreements recorded, no concerns raised to staff, and no requests for assistance. Later in the evening, family members attended onboard entertainment and social venues that were operating late into the night. These areas were designed to allow passengers to move freely between lounges, seating areas, and open deck spaces. Lighting and music levels varied by location, and the atmosphere was informal and relaxed. As the night progressed, the family gradually separated, as often happens during shared travel. Some members returned to their cabins earlier, while others remained in public areas for a longer period. This pattern was consistent with their previous evenings on the cruise. The last confirmed interaction between Amy and her family took place during the late hours of the night. Family members later stated that she appeared calm and in good spirits. There were no indications of distress or urgency, and no statements suggesting that she planned to leave the ship or meet someone privately. At some point during the early hours, Amy and her brother were together in a public area of the ship. This interaction is part of the confirmed timeline provided through family accounts and accepted by investigators. The two spoke briefly before separating. After that moment, Amy was last reliably known to be in a public space rather than in her cabin. There is no verified record of her entering another passenger's cabin, contacting crew members for assistance, or requesting help from ship personnel during the remainder of the night. Importantly, there is also no confirmed record of Amy being involved in any dispute or disturbance that would have attracted the attention of security staff. The ship's operational logs and staff reports from that night do not indicate any incidents connected to her. As the late-night period continued, passenger movement naturally decreased. Lounges closed gradually, and many passengers returned to their cabins. The open deck areas remained accessible, and some passengers continued to move through those spaces quietly. From an investigative perspective, this period presents one of the greatest limitations in the case. The ship did not maintain a continuous record of who entered or exited individual public spaces. Closed-circuit cameras were limited in number and coverage, and no footage was available that could confirm Amy's movements during the final portion of the night. The timeline, therefore, depends primarily on confirmed family statements and the absence of reports placing her elsewhere. Investigators later examined whether any crew members had recalled seeing Amy during the late-night hours. According to official summaries, no verified crew sightings could be established after the last family interaction. This does not mean she was not seen by staff. It means that no recollection could be confirmed with sufficient detail to be relied upon as evidence. The same limitation applied to other passengers. Although the ship carried a large number of people, no witness was able to provide a confirmed account placing Amy in a specific location after she was last seen by her family. This absence of reliable observation is partly explained by the nature of the setting. Passengers frequently pass one another without exchanging names or engaging in conversation. Faces are unfamiliar. Encounters are brief. Without a reason to take particular notice of someone, memory of individual presence becomes uncertain. Investigators also considered whether Amy had returned to her cabin later that night. No confirmed record places her there after the final family interaction. Her cabin showed no signs of activity or disturbance consistent with her returning during the early morning hours. This absence of confirmation does not establish where she went. It only establishes where she was not reliably recorded. Another factor examined was whether Amy had been involved in any organized activity or event that evening which could provide a clearer movement pattern. No such activity was identified. The evening followed a general leisure format rather than a scheduled group program that required registration or attendance logs. As a result, The final evening on board remains defined by a narrow set of verified moments and a broad span of unobserved time. The confirmed record shows normal family interaction, gradual separation as the night progressed, and a final brief contact with her brother. Beyond that point, the timeline becomes uncertain. There is no verified evidence of where Amy went next. There is no confirmed witness who can place her in a particular location during the final hours. There is no technical record that can reconstruct her movements through the ship. From an investigative standpoint, this is not an unusual limitation in cases that occur in shared public environments. It is, however, particularly significant in a setting where physical exit from the environment is not straightforward. The ship itself continued its overnight journey through open water. Cabins remained occupied. Public spaces were cleaned and reset for the following day, and the quiet transition from night to morning took place without any immediate recognition that a single passenger had quietly vanished from the routines of the vessel. The final evening, therefore, closes not with a clear moment of crisis, but with a calm and ordinary ending to a family interaction. It is the absence that follows, rather than any disturbance that night, which would later define the case. The morning began quietly, following the same routine that had shaped every previous day of the voyage for Amy Lynn Bradley and her family. According to confirmed family statements, Amy's father awoke first inside the family cabin during the early morning hours. At that point, there was no immediate reason for concern. Amy had often slept late during the trip, and it was not unusual for family members to wake at different times. When her father looked toward the area where Amy would normally have been sleeping, he noticed that she was not in her bed. Initially, this did not appear unusual. Cruise ships offer many shared spaces, and it was common for family members to move between cabins and public areas without leaving notes or messages. The expectation was that Amy was somewhere else on the ship. After a short period of waiting, her father stepped outside the cabin to look along the nearby corridor and surrounding public areas. He did not find her in those immediate spaces. He then returned to the cabin and informed the rest of the family that Amy was not there. At that point, the family began a more deliberate search of the areas they knew she had visited during the previous evening and earlier in the trip. They checked nearby decks, common seating areas, and walkways that were accessible from their cabin level. This initial search was informal and family-led. It reflected the normal assumption that a missing family member aboard a large ship was likely to be resting, socializing, or visiting a public area. When these checks did not locate Amy, the family contacted ship staff to request assistance. According to confirmed accounts, crew members responded by initiating internal procedures for locating a passenger. This included contacting senior officers and beginning coordinated searches of public spaces and work areas. At this stage, the ship was already approaching its next scheduled port of call. This created an immediate operational challenge. The vessel was preparing for arrival, and hundreds of passengers were expected to disembark within a short period. The ship's command staff had to balance routine port operations with an emerging concern that a passenger could not be located. Crew members began searching areas that were not normally accessed by passengers, including certain service corridors and restricted spaces. These checks were conducted methodically and under the supervision of senior ship personnel. At the same time, announcements were not made over the public address system. This decision reflected standard practice in situations where a passenger is temporarily unaccounted for, but where there is no confirmed indication of danger. The ship's officers also reviewed internal records to confirm that Amy had not formally disembarked during the night, or been recorded as leaving the vessel through any controlled access point. No such record was found. As the search continued, the family remained in close contact with ship staff. According to later statements, they were informed that a coordinated internal search was underway, and that crew members were checking multiple decks simultaneously. Despite these efforts, Amy could not be located anywhere on the ship. As the scheduled arrival at port became imminent, the situation changed. Once a ship docks, passengers begin leaving in large numbers, and the ability to preserve the internal environment becomes increasingly limited. Crew members must perform access checks, assist with passenger movement, and coordinate with port authorities. At that point, senior officers determined that the situation could no longer be managed solely as an internal matter. The disappearance of a passenger required formal notification to external authorities. According to confirmed records, law enforcement and maritime authorities were contacted shortly thereafter. Responsibility for the case began to move beyond the ship's internal command structure. For the family, this transition marked the moment when uncertainty became formalized into an investigation. Up until that point, the expectation had been that Amy would be found somewhere on board, delayed, asleep, or temporarily unaccounted for. Once the ship's full internal search failed to locate her, that expectation changed. From an investigative standpoint, the timing of the discovery is important. There was no report of an emergency during the night. No alarm had been raised. No crew member had been alerted to a possible incident involving Amy in the early hours. The first recognition that something was wrong occurred only after normal morning routines had already begun. This meant that the period in which Amy could have gone missing extended across several hours without direct observation. It also meant that potential witnesses, both passengers and crew, had already begun their normal activities, preparing for arrival and departure at the next port. The ship's environment, which had been relatively stable overnight, was now entering a phase of rapid movement and transition. Investigators later identified this as one of the most significant limitations of the case. By the time the disappearance was formally recognized, the opportunity to isolate specific locations, restrict movement within the vessel, or secure public areas had already passed. This was not the result of error or neglect. It reflected the operational reality of life aboard a commercial cruise ship. Incidents are rare. Most missing person situations resolve quickly. The structure of shipboard procedures is designed to support safety and travel logistics, not criminal investigation. The morning therefore unfolded quietly and without urgency, until the absence could no longer be explained by ordinary movement or routine. For the Bradley family, the shift from informal searching to official investigation occurred in a matter of hours. For the ship, the day continued according to schedule. Passengers prepared to disembark, crew prepared for port operations, and within that normal transition from sea to shore, a single missing passenger became the focus of a process that would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of the vessel itself. Once the absence of Amy Lynn Bradley was formally reported to ship personnel, responsibility moved from family-led searching to the vessel's internal command and security structure. According to confirmed accounts provided by the family and later investigative summaries, senior ship officers were notified and an organized search was initiated. This followed the company's established procedures for locating a missing passenger during an active voyage. Crew members were assigned to search different sections of the ship simultaneously. Public areas, including lounges, corridors, stairwells, and open deck spaces, were checked first. These were locations where passengers most commonly spend time and where someone could reasonably be resting or waiting without attracting attention. The search then expanded into areas that were not normally open to passengers. These included service corridors, staff work areas, storage rooms, and sections of the ship used for housekeeping and technical operations. Crew members who had authorized access to these areas were tasked with checking them under the direction of supervisory staff. Cabin areas were also reviewed. Crew members checked for signs that Amy may have entered another passenger's room or remained inside a cabin that had not yet been serviced that morning. No confirmed indication was found that she had stayed overnight in a different cabin. Throughout this process, ship officers coordinated movement through internal communication channels rather than public announcements. This approach reflected standard shipboard practice, where missing person situations are initially treated as operational matters, unless there is a clear indication of danger or medical emergency. At the same time, the ship's administrative staff reviewed available internal records. These included cabin assignments, key access information where applicable, and boarding documentation. The purpose was to confirm that Amy had not formally exited the vessel at any point during the night or early morning. No record of disembarkation was identified. The ship's bridge and senior officers were kept informed as the searches progressed. Updates were provided regularly, and areas already checked were documented to avoid duplication. This structured approach allowed crew members to cover a large and complex environment in a relatively short period of time. Despite these coordinated efforts, Amy could not be located anywhere on board. From a procedural perspective, the limitations of the ship's environment became increasingly apparent during these searches. While crew members could physically check rooms and corridors, there was no technical system capable of reconstructing passenger movement across the vessel during the night. Access points between decks, public areas, and outdoor walkways were open and unsupervised during late-night hours. There were no logs showing who had passed through particular spaces, and camera coverage did not provide comprehensive visibility of movement. Crew members were also asked whether they had observed Amy during their overnight duties. According to confirmed summaries, no staff member was able to provide a reliable sighting after the final family interaction the previous evening. This did not indicate that she had not been seen. It indicated that no recollection could be verified with sufficient clarity to support an investigative timeline. The internal search continued as the ship prepared for its scheduled arrival at the next port. This created increasing operational pressure. Crew members were required to perform arrival duties, assist passengers, and coordinate with port authorities while the search was still ongoing. Senior officers were therefore required to make parallel decisions. They continued internal searching where possible, while also preparing to escalate the situation to external authorities in accordance with maritime procedures. The ship's medical and welfare staff were also consulted. There were no reports of Amy having sought medical assistance, and no record of her being admitted to the ship's medical facilities during the night or early morning. As the time of arrival approached, the ship's leadership concluded that the situation could no longer be managed solely through internal procedures. The failure to locate a passenger after a full internal search required formal notification to law enforcement and maritime authorities. From an investigative standpoint, this point marked the end of the purely shipboard phase of the response. Up until this moment, the disappearance had been treated as an operational problem that might resolve through location and welfare checks. Once that possibility had been exhausted, the event became an external investigative matter. The internal searches themselves were thorough within the limits of the environment. Crew members checked accessible spaces, reviewed records, and consulted relevant staff. However, they were constrained by the design of the ship and by the absence of any system capable of tracing a person's movement in real time. In later reviews, investigators acknowledged that the ship's response followed accepted practice for the period and for the type of incident initially suspected. There was no indication that the crew delayed initiating searches once the absence was reported. There was also no evidence that any restricted area remained unchecked during the internal phase. The difficulty lay not in the willingness to search, but in the nature of the setting itself. A cruise ship is not designed to preserve environments for investigation. It is designed to operate continuously, to move between ports, and to support the routines of thousands of people at once. By the time the internal procedures reached their natural limit, the ship was already transitioning into port operations, and within that transition, the search for one missing passenger had reached the point where responsibility would soon move beyond the vessel and into a much wider and more complex investigative framework. Once it had been confirmed that Amy Lynn Bradley could not be located anywhere on board, the ship's officers moved from internal procedures to formal external notification. This transition is a required step in maritime operations when a serious incident involves a passenger whose whereabouts cannot be accounted for through shipboard systems and searches. According to verified accounts, senior officers on the vessel contacted the appropriate maritime and law enforcement authorities to report that a passenger was missing and that an internal search had been completed without result. At sea, responsibility for an incident does not rest with a single police department in the way it would on land. Instead, several layers of jurisdiction must be considered at the same time. The ship itself operates under the authority of its flag state, meaning the country in which the vessel is formally registered. At the same time, the location of the ship at the moment an incident occurs determines which coastal or port authorities may become involved. In addition to this, the nationality of the missing person can influence which national law enforcement agencies are notified. In Amy's case, the situation involved international waters, a foreign registered commercial vessel, and an American citizen. This immediately placed the case within a multi-jurisdictional framework. The ship's officers were required to notify maritime authorities responsible for incidents occurring at sea, and to ensure that relevant national agencies were informed once the ship approached port. Because Amy was a United States citizen, responsibility for follow-up investigation on behalf of her family and government was later assumed by United States authorities, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This involvement did not replace maritime responsibility. It added a second investigative layer focused on the missing person rather than on vessel operations. At the time the disappearance was reported, the ship was approaching a scheduled port of call. This created an immediate practical issue. Once a vessel docks, responsibility for activities on and around the ship becomes shared between the ship's command, port authorities, and national law enforcement agencies within that territory. Passengers and crew begin disembarking. Supplies are loaded. Port security procedures come into effect. This operational transition limits the ability to treat the vessel as a controlled environment. As a result, the initial notification to authorities had to occur quickly enough for coordination to be established before large-scale movement of people took place. From a legal perspective, the situation was complex. The disappearance was believed to have occurred while the ship was at sea, rather than within the territorial waters of a specific country. That meant no single national police force automatically held full investigative authority over the incident itself. Instead, responsibility was shared between maritime regulators, the ship's operating company, and the national authorities connected to the missing passenger. This division of responsibility shaped how the case developed. Maritime authorities focused on safety compliance, operational reporting, and incident documentation. Their role was to ensure that the ship's procedures had been followed and that relevant records were preserved. National law enforcement agencies focused on the missing person investigation, including family liaison, information gathering, and coordination with other jurisdictions. The ship's operating company was required to preserve internal records, provide staff statements, and support investigative access where permitted by maritime and employment regulations. For the family, this structure could feel unclear. There was no single officer who could immediately take ownership of the entire situation. Communication flowed between ship officers, port officials, company representatives, and law enforcement agencies. Each organization worked within its own authority and legal limits. This is one of the defining challenges of incidents that occur at sea. Unlike an event that takes place in a city or town, there is no local police station whose officers arrive and assume full control. Instead, responsibility is distributed. As the ship arrived at port, local authorities were notified that a missing person case was being referred. At the same time, the ship's officers prepared formal incident documentation to support later investigative review. Crew members who had participated in searches and who had been on duty during the relevant overnight period were identified for later statements. Passenger lists, cabin records, and operational logs were secured. From an investigative standpoint, this handover period is critical. It determines what documentation is preserved, how quickly information is shared, and how accurately the internal events of the ship can be reconstructed by agencies that were not present at the time. In this case, there was no immediate criminal classification. The disappearance was treated as a missing person incident. There was no confirmed evidence of a crime having taken place on board. This distinction matters because it affects the legal powers available to authorities and the urgency with which certain investigative measures can be taken. Search and rescue responsibility at sea also operates under its own framework. Once a person is believed to be missing over open water, maritime coordination centers assess the available information to determine whether and how a search operation can be conducted. These decisions depend on last confirmed sighting time, weather conditions, ship movement, and the availability of vessels or aircraft. In Amy's case, the absence of a confirmed point at which she was seen to enter the water made such assessment extremely difficult. There was no verified time or location that could serve as a starting reference. This uncertainty limited the ability of maritime authorities to initiate a targeted search at sea. As jurisdictional responsibility was clarified, United States authorities began their involvement through established international and diplomatic channels. Information was exchanged between the ship's operators, port authorities, and investigative agencies. From that point onward, the case existed within two parallel systems. One concerned the operational and regulatory review of what occurred on the vessel. The other concerned the investigation into what may have happened to a missing person whose last confirmed location was aboard a commercial ship. The separation of those responsibilities is not a failure of coordination. It reflects the legal reality of maritime activity. At sea, safety, regulation, vessel oversight, and criminal investigation do not operate under a single command structure. They overlap, they cooperate, but they remain institutionally distinct. This structure would continue to shape every later stage of the case, not because of lack of interest or effort, but because incidents that occur between borders must always be managed within the limits of shared authority. In the days that followed, formal investigative responsibility would become clearer. But in these first hours, the disappearance of one passenger had already become an international matter. Quietly crossing legal boundaries at the same pace, the ship itself continued moving through open water. When the ship arrived at port, following the report that Amy Lynn Bradley could not be located, the operational environment changed immediately. Port arrival is one of the busiest phases of any cruise voyage. Passengers prepare to disembark, crew members manage access points, and port authorities take responsibility for security and movement on the dockside. This transition creates a rapid and unavoidable flow of people through controlled entry and exit areas. At the same time, the ship's officers were already aware that a missing person case had been declared and that external authorities had been notified. The challenge they faced was how to preserve useful information in a setting that was designed to move forward on schedule. Disembarkation procedures continued in accordance with port and company requirements. Passengers left the ship in organized groups, guided by staff and local port personnel. There was no full suspension of passenger movement, because there was no confirmed indication that a crime had occurred on board, and no clear legal basis to detain individuals. This limitation would later become one of the most significant practical difficulties in the early investigation. Once passengers left the vessel, the opportunity to verify observations, movements, and interactions from the previous night became far more restricted. In the hours that followed, investigators and company representatives began collecting initial witness information from crew members and selected passengers who had been identified as potentially relevant. These early statements focused on whether anyone had seen Amy during the late-night hours or early morning period, and whether any unusual situations had been noticed in public areas, corridors, or deck spaces. According to confirmed investigative summaries, no witness was able to provide a verified sighting of Amy after the last confirmed interaction with her family. Several individuals reported that they believed they may have seen a woman resembling her on board. However, these recollections could not be confirmed through independent evidence such as photographs, video recordings, or corroborating statements from other witnesses. This distinction between reported observation and verified sighting became central to how early information was assessed. The ship carried a large number of passengers, many of whom had only brief and casual contact with one another. Clothing, lighting, and the informal nature of social spaces made later identification difficult. In addition, passengers were not familiar with Amy personally. Most had no reason to pay special attention to individual faces or to remember specific interactions, unless something unusual had occurred. Crew members were also interviewed during this period. Those who had worked overnight shifts, cleaning schedules, bar service, and security rounds were asked whether they had observed Amy during their duties. According to official records, no crew member could reliably confirm having seen her during the final overnight hours. Some staff recalled general passenger activity in certain areas, but none of these recollections could be connected to Amy with certainty. The movement of the ship into port further complicated the process. Crew duties changed rapidly. Staff were reassigned to arrival tasks. Some personnel completed shifts and rotated off duty. Others began preparing the vessel for the next stage of the voyage. This operational turnover meant that the window for collecting fresh, detailed memory was narrow. Investigators later noted that while early statements were gathered promptly, the nature of the environment limited how precise those statements could be. There were no registration systems for late-night venue attendants. There were no entry or exit logs for public areas. There was no comprehensive video coverage that could be reviewed to supplement human memory. Another complicating factor involved passengers who disembarked and returned to different countries or regions. Once people had left the ship and traveled onward, arranging follow-up interviews became more complex. Contact details were often incomplete, and international coordination was required to reach individuals who no longer remained within the same legal jurisdiction. As a result, early witness accounts remained fragmented. They provided general impressions rather than specific, verifiable detail. Investigators also examined whether anyone had observed Amy near controlled access points, such as gangways or service doors, during the early morning hours. According to confirmed records, no staff member or Port Authority official reported seeing her disembark. This absence of confirmation did not establish that she had not left the ship. It established only that there was no verified observation of her doing so. From an investigative standpoint, this distinction mattered greatly. Without a confirmed sighting at the point of disembarkation, it was not possible to determine whether Amy had left the vessel voluntarily, unintentionally, or at all. The ship's internal access records did not contain passenger-level movement data. Boarding and departure controls were designed for ticketing and security purposes, not for retrospective behavioral reconstruction. As the first day progressed, early witness information was compiled and reviewed. Investigators assessed consistency between accounts, checked timing against known ship schedules, and reviewed which areas had been staffed at relevant times. No clear pattern emerged. There was no cluster of sightings that could place Amy reliably in one location. There was no single observation that could be treated as a confirmed final sighting, beyond the family timeline already established. The early witness phase therefore ended quietly and without resolution. It provided context. It ruled out some possibilities, but it did not create a new, reliable point of reference. For the investigation, This meant that the disappearance remained anchored to the narrow window defined by family accounts, rather than expanded by independent observation. And as the ship continued its itinerary, and the passengers dispersed into different ports and countries, the opportunity to reconstruct the final hours through direct witness testimony began to fade, leaving investigators with only what could be verified, carefully recorded and preserved from the earliest moments of response. Once the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley had been formally reported and the shipboard phase had ended, responsibility for the case moved into the hands of external law enforcement agencies. Because Amy was a United States citizen and the incident involved international travel, the early investigative structure was organized through United States authorities, with coordination across maritime and foreign jurisdictions. One of the principal agencies involved in supporting the investigation was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At this stage, the case was classified as a missing person investigation. There was no confirmed evidence of a crime having occurred on board the vessel, and no physical evidence indicating violence or coercion. This classification shaped how the investigation could proceed. Unlike a confirmed criminal offense, a missing person case does not automatically trigger search warrants, arrests, or seizure of private property. Investigators must work within a narrower legal framework, relying heavily on voluntary cooperation, documentation review, and witness statements. The first priority for law enforcement was to secure and preserve information from the cruise company and from the ship's command staff. Investigators requested copies of passenger manifests, crew lists, cabin assignments, duty rosters, and internal incident logs. These records provided a structural overview of who was present on board and which crew members were assigned to specific areas during the relevant time period. Investigators also began collecting formal statements from family members. These interviews focused on establishing a reliable and consistent timeline for Amy's movements during the final evening and the early hours of the morning. Family statements were treated as foundational evidence because they represented the last confirmed observations of Amy before she went missing. At the same time, investigators sought access to any available technical records from the ship. This included limited camera footage from selected public areas, access point records, and internal communication logs between ship officers during the search phase, according to later investigative summaries. This technical material did not provide a clear record of Amy's movements. Coverage was incomplete, and the available footage did not capture the locations where she was last known to have been. This absence of usable visual evidence immediately narrowed the scope of what could be reconstructed. Early investigative direction therefore focused on three parallel areas. The first involved reconstructing Amy's confirmed timeline as precisely as possible, using family accounts, crew statements, and known ship schedules. The second involved assessing whether there was any indication that she had left the vessel during the port arrival period. The third involved evaluating whether any interaction with passengers or crew during the final evening warranted further inquiry. In relation to disembarkation, investigators worked with port authorities and the cruise operator to determine whether any boarding or exit controls could provide confirmation of her presence at the gangway or terminal area. As established earlier, no verified observation or record placed Amy at a point of departure. This meant that investigators could not treat the case as one involving confirmed departure into a foreign country. At the same time, there was also no confirmed indication that she had fallen overboard or entered the water. Without a verified time or location for such an event, maritime search and rescue authorities could not identify a defined search area. This lack of a reference point placed a significant constraint on the investigation from the very beginning. The early interviews of crew members and passengers were reviewed again by law enforcement personnel, this time with investigative rather than operational objectives. Statements collected by the cruise company were re-examined to identify any inconsistencies, additional details, or potential gaps. However, as in the initial shipboard review, no verified witness account emerged that could place Amy in a specific location during the critical period after her last confirmed family interaction. Investigators also examined whether any reports of disturbances, medical calls, or security incidents on board during the night could be connected to her disappearance. According to confirmed records, no such reports were identified. This absence of related operational events supported the conclusion that, if something unusual had occurred, it had not been observed or reported through normal ship procedures. Another early focus involved reviewing the professional background and access of crew members who had been working in the areas closest to where Amy had last been seen. This was not based on suspicion, but on standard investigative practice in controlled environments. Investigators sought to establish who had legitimate access to different parts of the ship, what their normal duties involved, and whether any deviations from routine schedules had occurred. No confirmed evidence emerged during this early review to suggest misconduct by any crew member. Similarly, investigators examined whether Amy had any known disputes or unusual interactions with other passengers that might require focused follow-up. No such information was identified in verified statements. As the first phase of law enforcement involvement progressed, one of the most difficult aspects of the case became increasingly clear. There was no starting point. There was no confirmed location at which Amy had last been seen by an independent witness. There was no physical scene to secure. There was no clear moment at which an incident could be said to have occurred. Instead, the investigation had to begin from a quiet absence, detected hours after the relevant period had passed, in an environment that had already transitioned through a major operational change. For investigators, this meant that the early direction of the case remained broad. Rather than narrowing quickly toward a single explanation, the inquiry remained open to multiple possibilities, while remaining anchored to what could be verified. Importantly, authorities also began receiving information from outside the ship environment. Friends, extended family members, and members of the public began to contact law enforcement with recollections, suggestions, and concerns. Each piece of information was recorded and assessed, but only those supported by verifiable detail were considered suitable for follow-up. This careful filtering was necessary to protect the integrity of the investigation. As the first days passed, the investigative approach settled into a steady and methodical pattern. Information was gathered, statements were cross-checked, records were preserved, and potential lines of inquiry were identified, prioritized, and reviewed. The absence of immediate results did not reflect a lack of activity. It reflected the reality of beginning a complex investigation without a defined incident, without a physical scene, and without a confirmed final sighting. From the very beginning, the case was shaped by limitation rather than opportunity, and that early constraint would continue to influence every later stage of the investigation into what happened to Amy Bradley aboard the moving, shared, and carefully regulated world of a commercial cruise ship. In the months and years following the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley, one of the most complex aspects of the investigation became the handling of reported sightings and public information. As the case gained wider attention, law enforcement agencies began receiving reports from individuals who believed they had seen Amy after the cruise had ended. These reports came from different countries and from a wide range of circumstances, including casual encounters in public places and observations made during travel. Each report was recorded and assessed using the same structured process. Investigators first examined whether the person providing the information could reliably place themselves at the reported location and time. They then reviewed whether any independent evidence could support the claim, such as travel records, photographs, or confirmation from other witnesses. In most cases, this initial verification step presented immediate difficulty. The reported sightings were often based on brief visual impressions of someone who resembled Amy. The encounters were short, took place in busy environments, and occurred without any interaction that would allow identity to be confirmed. This created a fundamental limitation. Physical resemblance alone is not sufficient for identification, particularly when the observer has no personal connection to the missing person and no opportunity to confirm distinguishing features. Investigators also faced the challenge of time. Many sightings were reported days, weeks, or even months after they were said to have occurred. This delay reduced the ability to locate relevant surveillance footage, travel records, or transactional data that might otherwise have supported or disproved the claim. In several cases, by the time investigators were informed, the locations involved no longer retained usable records. Another complicating factor was the emotional context in which these reports were made. High-profile missing person cases often generate strong public attention, and individuals may genuinely believe they have recognized a familiar face after seeing media coverage. This does not imply bad faith. It reflects the way human perception and memory operate when exposed to repeated images and narratives. For investigators, however, the distinction between sincere belief and verifiable evidence is essential. Reported sightings were therefore treated as information to be assessed, rather than as confirmation of continued presence. Some reports were more detailed than others. In a small number of cases, individuals described interactions that included brief conversations, shared environments, or repeated observation over a short period. These accounts were prioritized for review. Even in those instances, however, verification proved extremely difficult. Without direct identification, supporting documentation, or corroborating witnesses, investigators could not establish that the person observed was Amy, rather than someone with a similar appearance. The international nature of the reported sightings introduced additional challenges. Because reports came from multiple countries, verification required coordination with foreign law enforcement agencies and, in some cases, with private businesses such as hotels or transport providers. Access to records depended on local data retention practices and legal frameworks. This process could be slow, and in many instances the necessary documentation was no longer available by the time inquiries were made. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that some reports were influenced by a media portrayal of the case. Photographs of Amy circulated widely, and distinctive features described in public appeals became familiar to large audiences. This exposure increased the likelihood that unrelated individuals might be perceived as resembling her. For this reason, investigators placed greater weight on reports that included details not publicly known, such as unique personal characteristics or behaviors. Even then, such information still required independent confirmation before it could be treated as evidence. In parallel with evaluating reported sightings, investigators also reviewed information suggesting possible movement or contact after the cruise. These included claims that Amy had been seen working in specific locations or traveling with other individuals. According to confirmed investigative summaries, none of these claims could be substantiated through records, employment, documentation, or verified witness statements. As the number of reports increased, the investigative team faced a growing administrative burden. Each report required documentation, initial assessment, and, where possible, follow-up verification. The majority of reports could not progress beyond preliminary review. This volume of unverified information did not indicate failure. It reflected the reality of public engagement in high-profile missing person cases. The difficulty lies not in receiving information, but in separating what can be confirmed from what cannot. Another important limitation was the absence of a confirmed reference point after the cruise. Without a verified post-disappearance sighting, investigators could not establish a new starting location for the case. Every reported observation remained disconnected from the last confirmed moment of Amy's presence on the ship. This prevented the construction of a coherent movement pattern or geographical trail. Over time, investigators developed a structured framework for managing these reports. Information was categorized according to reliability, detail, and corroboration potential. Reports that lacked specific time or location detail were deprioritized. Reports that could be cross-checked against records were reviewed in coordination with relevant agencies. This process allowed the investigation to remain open to new information without allowing unverified claims to redirect resources away from established lines of inquiry. For the Bradley family, the existence of reported sightings was emotionally complex. On one hand, each report carried the possibility of progress. On the other, repeated verification failures reinforced the uncertainty that had already become part of daily life. From an investigative perspective, reported sightings represent both opportunity and risk. They offer potential points of contact beyond the original location, but they also carry a high probability of misidentification. In Amy's case, the absence of any sighting that could be independently verified meant that none of the reported observations altered the fundamental structure of the investigation. They did not provide a new confirmed location. They did not establish a new timeline. They did not lead to the identification of any individual connected to her disappearance. Instead, they remained part of the background information landscape of the case, carefully preserved, reviewed periodically, and re-evaluated when new tools or new information became available. The handling of reported sightings, therefore, illustrates one of the central realities of long-term missing person investigations. Not every lead can be followed to a conclusion. Not every account can be verified. And in environments shaped by distance, international movement, and public attention, the challenge is not the lack of information. It is the discipline required to accept uncertainty when evidence cannot support belief. As the investigation into the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley continued without a confirmed outcome, the role of her family gradually expanded beyond private cooperation with investigators and into sustained public advocacy. From an early stage, the family worked closely with law enforcement agencies to support the distribution of accurate information. Photographs, physical descriptions, and confirmed details about Amy's appearance and travel were shared through official channels so that any potential witness could be directed to the correct reporting process. These materials were prepared with the intention of supporting identification, not encouraging speculation. Public appeals were carefully structured. The family asked for information only from individuals who believed they had genuinely seen Amy or possessed verifiable knowledge connected to the case. They consistently encouraged members of the public to contact law enforcement directly, rather than attempting to investigate independently or share unverified claims through media or informal networks. As national and international media attention increased, the family became the most visible representatives of the case. Interviews were conducted with a focus on maintaining awareness, rather than promoting particular theories. In public statements, family members avoided making accusations or assigning responsibility. Their emphasis remained on locating Amy and encouraging anyone with reliable information to come forward. For investigators, this approach was important. High-profile missing person cases often generate a wide range of unverified narratives. By maintaining consistent messaging and directing information through official channels, the family helped reduce the risk that public attention would overwhelm the investigation with speculative material. Media organizations responded to the case in different ways. Some outlets focused on the procedural aspects of the investigation and the challenges associated with incidents at sea. Others placed greater emphasis on the emotional impact of the disappearance and the uncertainty experienced by the family. Over time, the case became part of a broader public conversation about safety and accountability in large commercial travel environments. Despite this attention, law enforcement agencies remained cautious in their public communication. Updates were limited to confirmed information. Investigators declined to comment on unverified sightings, internal assessments, or intelligence that could not be supported by evidence. This restraint sometimes created tension between public curiosity and professional obligation, but it reflected the need to protect the integrity of the case. As years passed, periodic media coverage returned to the story, often prompted by anniversaries, renewed appeals from the family, or broader reporting on missing persons and maritime incidents. Each renewed wave of attention brought additional reports and messages from members of the public. Investigators continued to review these submissions, applying the same verification standards that had been in place from the beginning. For the family, long-term public advocacy became part of daily life. Maintaining awareness required sustained emotional effort and careful communication. Public appeals had to be balanced against the need for privacy and the emotional toll of repeated exposure to unresolved uncertainty. At the same time, the family worked with support organizations and missing persons networks to ensure that Amy's case remained visible within professional and volunteer communities. These networks helped distribute verified materials, maintain case listings, and support international reach when reports originated outside the United States. Media attention also introduced practical challenges. In some instances, unverified claims or misinterpretations were repeated in public forums before investigators could assess them. Law enforcement agencies and family representatives occasionally clarified information to prevent confusion, particularly when inaccurate details began circulating widely. Throughout this period, the family's public role remained consistent in tone. Their communication focused on factual information, respectful requests for assistance, and continued cooperation with authorities. There was no attempt to create pressure on specific individuals or institutions, and no public promotion of speculative explanations. From an investigative perspective, sustained public awareness serves a limited but important purpose. It increases the likelihood that someone with relevant previously unreported information may recognize its significance and choose to come forward. However, it cannot replace the need for verifiable evidence, structured inquiry, and legal thresholds. The case therefore entered a long-term pattern in which public attention and professional investigation operated alongside one another, but remained clearly separated in function. The family continued to speak publicly. Investigators continued to work privately. Information flowed through controlled reporting channels. Over time, the presence of the case in public memory became quieter but more enduring. It was no longer driven by immediate news events, but by the steady commitment of a family who continued to ask for help, and by institutions that continued to maintain the case as active and unresolved. In this way, family advocacy and media attention became part of the wider environment surrounding the investigation, not as a substitute for professional work, but as a parallel effort to keep the search for reliable information open, visible and accessible for as long as uncertainty remained. As the years passed after the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley, the investigation gradually shifted from immediate response into long-term case maintenance. This transition did not mean the case was closed. It meant that the way it was managed changed. Investigators moved from active scene review and early witness collection into structured reassessment, record preservation, and periodic review of incoming information. The purpose of this phase was to ensure that no verified detail was lost as time passed, and that new information could still be evaluated against the original record. Responsibility for maintaining the case remained with United States authorities, working alongside international and maritime partners when required. Case files were retained in active status, and contact between agencies continued through established channels used for missing persons and cross-border investigations. One of the most significant challenges during this long-term phase was the absence of any confirmed post-disappearance reference point. No verified sighting, communication, or documented movement could establish where Amy was after she was last seen on board the ship. Without such a reference, investigators were unable to define a new geographical starting point for focused searches or intelligence work. As a result, the case remained anchored to the narrow window of time and location that had already been established. Periodic case reviews were conducted to ensure that earlier decisions, assessments, and conclusions remained appropriate in light of changing investigative tools and evolving information systems. These reviews included re-examination of statements, timelines, internal reports, and correspondence collected during the first days and weeks after the disappearance. Investigators assessed whether advances in data sharing, digital record access, and international coordination could offer new ways to verify earlier claims or reopen lines of inquiry that had previously reached practical limits. In some instances, information from reported sightings or public submissions was revisited when new verification methods became available. However, no new evidence emerged that could confirm Amy's presence in any location after the cruise. Over time, the case also became subject to broader institutional monitoring, rather than continuous field investigation. Information about Amy remained present within national and international missing persons systems. When law enforcement agencies in other jurisdictions received reports that appeared potentially relevant, those details could be referred back to the original case file. This quiet form of monitoring does not generate frequent public updates. It operates through background coordination rather than visible activity. It ensures that the case remains accessible to professionals who may encounter information connected to it in unrelated investigations. The passage of time also created unavoidable constraints. Witness memory fades. Individuals who were present on the ship move on with their lives, relocate to different countries, or become difficult to trace. Records held by private companies and service providers are not preserved indefinitely. Some documentation that might have supported later verification no longer exists. These limitations do not reflect neglect. They reflect the operational realities of long-term investigations, particularly those that begin without a defined crime scene and without a confirmed moment of disappearance. For investigators, the continued absence of evidence requires a disciplined approach. Information is preserved carefully. New reports are assessed without assumption. Investigative confidence is not treated as equivalent to legal proof. The threshold for action remains high, because any future development must be capable of withstanding independent scrutiny. For the family, the long-term nature of the case has meant living with a form of uncertainty that does not resolve through process alone. There is no official conclusion to accept. There is no confirmed explanation to review. There is only the continued possibility that new information may emerge, balanced against the recognition that time does not make such outcomes more likely. From an institutional perspective, the case remains open. It is maintained as an unresolved missing person investigation. It is preserved within professional systems designed to support re-examination when new intelligence, technology, or international cooperation makes further review possible. Importantly, the continuing uncertainty surrounding Amy's disappearance does not imply that all lines of inquiry remain equally active. Investigators prioritize information that can be tested. They focus on material that can be verified through records, documentation, or corroborated witness testimony. They avoid pursuing narratives that cannot be supported by evidence, even when those narratives receive public attention. This distinction between possibility and proof remains central to how the case is managed. The passage of time has not changed the foundational structure of the investigation. There is still no confirmed sighting after the ship. There is still no verified location to which searches can be directed. There is still no physical evidence that can establish what occurred during the final unobserved hours. What remains is a carefully preserved record, a timeline that has been examined repeatedly, and a case that continues to exist within professional memory. maintained quietly and methodically by those whose responsibility it is to hold unresolved investigations open, even when resolution remains uncertain. In that sense, the case of Amy Bradley has become defined not only by what is unknown, but by the sustained effort to ensure that what is known is never lost, misinterpreted, or forgotten. As the ship's wake disappears into open water, the story of Amy Lynn Bradley settles into a quieter and more reflective place. With time, this case has come to represent not only the disappearance of one person, but also the enduring limits faced by institutions that are asked to search for answers in environments that were never designed for investigation. Cruise ships are built for movement, comfort, and shared experience. They are not built to preserve moments, to hold still long enough for careful examination, or to provide the fixed reference points that most investigations depend upon. When something goes wrong at sea, the setting itself continues forward, carrying people, routines, and uncertainty along with it. For the professionals who inherit responsibility for cases like this, persistence does not always take the form of visible action. It appears instead through record-keeping, structured review, and quiet coordination across agencies and borders. Files are maintained, information is checked against evolving systems, and every new report is measured carefully against what is already known. In that work, certainty is never assumed, and conclusions are held open rather than declared. For the family, the passage of time carries a different meaning. Advocacy becomes part of daily life. Public appeals continue, even when responses grow quieter. Hope must exist alongside realism, and the desire for resolution must coexist with the knowledge that some investigations remain open not because effort has failed, but because evidence has never arrived. Unresolved cases create a particular kind of professional memory. They remain present within systems, not as closed files, but as records that must always remain available for review. They shape how future investigations are organized, how maritime procedures are reconsidered, and how responsibility is shared when incidents occur between borders rather than within them. The disappearance of Amy Bradley does not offer a clear ending. It offers instead a careful reminder of how uncertainty becomes part of institutional responsibility. The absence of answers does not remove the duty to continue listening for them. It only changes the pace at which the work is done. Tonight, there is no need to reach for explanation. This story does not belong to speculation. It belongs to the quiet, steady work of those who continue to hold space for what cannot yet be confirmed, and for a family whose search for information remains grounded in patience rather than assumption. As the night deepens around you, you can allow this case to rest gently where it now belongs, within professional memory and careful record. The sea continues its movement beyond view, and the routines of investigation continue quietly in the background, ready to respond if one small, verifiable piece of information should ever find its way back to the surface.